The first panel we have this afternoon is titled Gomery and the Value of Interdisciplinary Multi-Institutional Collaboration. Gomery is first and foremost about the science. Joining me today are 4 principal investigators who worked on 12 different Gomery-funded projects based in Mississippi. Before we get started on our discussion, I am going to give you a little background on each scientist and specifically on their oil spill science work. And remember, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can write them in the chat box or comment under the Facebook feed. Dr. Arne Diercks is an associate research professor at the Department of Marine Science at the University of Southern Mississippi. Dr. Diercks served as a PI or co-PI on 4 Gomery awards, a first-year block grant with the consortia ECOGIG and ECOGIG-II, and an RFP6 grant. He uses cutting-edge undersea tools to study the fate of marine snow, as well as the potential for oil-contaminated sediments to resuspend and redistribute along the seafloor after an event. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Joe Griffith is the director of the School of Ocean Science and Engineering at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he also holds the rank of associate professor. His research combines traditional ecotoxicological concepts with cutting-edge genomic and transcriptomic tools to investigate gene expression patterns in aquatic species exposed to environmental contaminants. Dr. Griffith served as the principal investigator on 3 different Gomery awards, researching various aspects of how oil and related stressors impact fish health and ecosystem functionality. Dr. Pat Fitzpatrick, I knew I was going to stumble over that, is an atmospheric science program coordinator at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi. He also consults as a weather forecaster and authored the reference book Hurricanes. He was also very helpful to us this week as we prepared for Hurricane Zeta. Dr. Fitzpatrick served as a PI or co-PI on 4 first-year block grants and later joined Concord while research faculty at Mississippi State University. His Gomery-funded research incorporated meteorological and ocean data to help understand what factors influence oil movement. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Dr. Jerry Wiggert is an associate professor in the Division of Marine Science at USM, where he is also the associate director of the School of Ocean Science and Engineering and the principal investigator of Concord. Dr. Wiggert is a numerical modeler whose research interests include the effect of how forces like wind and freshwater river input impact the physical and biogeochemical processes of nearby coastal waters, including the movement of oil spills. Thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate you being here. So I have a series of questions I'm going to ask you about your Gomery work. I need to move this a little bit so I can see you and the questions at the same time. So first off, what are some of the most fascinating or surprising discoveries that have come from the work you did in Mississippi while funded by Gomery?
Do you have any in particular you want to answer those questions, or should we just jump in?
Jump in. Some of these I can go left to right, but Dr. Griffith, you sound like you have something you want to say.
Well, I would just say that, as you said, we do a lot of genomic and transcriptomic research, and there was a lot of interest among those of us that do that sort of work at the beginning about whether or not some of the work that was done early on a few fish species, would those response patterns hold up to other species that weren't ones that were found, for example, in Prince William Sound for Exxon Valdez oil spill. And the work that I and my colleagues did and a lot of other very hardworking people over the last 10 years showed that in a lot of cases it really did. There are some patterns of response, even at very precise cellular or molecular response levels, that are kind of common or conserved across multiple fish species, across different types of exposure regimes and different environmental conditions. And that was obviously very interesting from a basic scientific standpoint, but also very useful when you're trying to use the data that those of us who are working on Gomery use that data to predict the effects, the environmental effects of future oil spills, because it implies that the data from one experiment or one incident can be used informatively to predict the effects of a later one.
So what were some of the common effects that you saw across species?
Well, so the one that was very commonly shown as a result of the following the Exxon Valdez oil spill was cardiac effects, the effect of developing hearts in larval fish was well studied and well understood. And the fact that we can show very, very similar responses across the species of fish that are present in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the ones that are present in Prince William Sound, was really interesting. It would have been difficult for it not to be, perhaps, given what we know about the interaction of oil and larval fish and the heart. But confirming that was obviously very interesting. One new one that we didn't understand quite as well, but still appears to be a response that many fish species display, is impact on cholesterol biosynthesis. And that's a particular interest because cholesterol is a precursor molecule for steroidogenesis, implying they can have a lot of other long-term effects.
Very cool. Dr. Diercks, did you have something?
Yes, I had something. I was actually lucky enough to be out on the 3 weeks before the Gomery project started on the Pelican, and we started looking at the sediments out there and looked at the water column properties, and we found that a deep plume in 800, 1200 meters of water depth, and on the surface we found large floating material, looked like aggregates. Somebody called it sea snot. It looked like something like that. It was basically large flocculent material, which was at the surface at the beginning and then disappeared within a couple of weeks. It was gone from the surface. We found it again with ROV videos under the surface, and later on it was found in coring on the seafloor. This material was then mapped by NERDA projects to see how this footprint, the oil surface footprint on the seafloor, how big it was, how much oil was on the seafloor, and then from there, how big was that footprint on the seafloor, and it had to be determined a certain size. And being a geologist in the background, not a biologist, but a geologist in this case, and doing some geomorphology before I joined marine science, I thought about how does this stuff work while it's settled down there? How does it get transported? Is it being transported? Is it stationary? Is it moving somewhere? So we found a team from 3 universities, from Florida and USM, and looked at the fate basically of this material on the seafloor. Once it's settled down, is it getting resuspended, basically be brought back up into the water column and then being redistributed afterwards? And the very interesting part with that is the answer is yes. We are almost ready to submit in the next week or two a paper on that, a synthesis paper, which looks at organic data, at chemistry, at radioisotopes, and at flume flow structures of sediments from cores we took back in 2018. And the indication is that the material is moving slowly to the southeast into the deeper Gulf of Mexico, thus increasing the priorly determined footprint of the oil spill on the seafloor by several miles, several tenths of miles to the southeast.
So, so it's not all picking up and moving, just some of it is moving, so it's spreading out. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, some of the material is being resuspended. The seafloor is not a uniform seafloor, so there's highs, lows in there, and currents flowing over it act differently with the seafloor, thus taking different amount of material into the water column, and that then is being transported either through gravity flows, through currents, to deep currents, basically sliding downhill over time, basically.
Okay, so I guess these are, if this is something you're just getting ready to publish, these are things that we will be
Correct.
researching for years to come to see how long and how far that travels.
Yes, we have something. It is an episodic event. It is not something which simply picks up and unrolls at a certain rate. There's episodic events where how the stuff is being resuspended and then moved. And we are trying to, or we have some numbers of it, the way it's moving down to the southeast of this part. So.
Very interesting. So Dr. Wiggert and Dr. Fitzpatrick, you were both with Concord. What would you say was the big reveal from Concord? I know you studied freshwater movement into the Gulf.
Okay. Well, Jerry's the PI for Concord, so I'll let him take that initially. And if we have time, I'll talk a little more.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the things, and you kind of know it maybe notionally, but there were some data that we could collect, which was providing chemical sort of understanding of what water masses were where. And one of the things that was really interesting that came out of some of the Concord work was understanding when and to what degree the Mississippi itself is on the, the shelf of Mississippi versus the other freshwater sources all along the coast. And it turns out the Mississippi River per se is not necessarily a strong player, but at times it's kind of the elephant in the room. And that was one of the things, both from observations, and then we backed it up with that modeling effort that was stood up as part of Concord that we were doing, and the Bonnie Carey spillway opening that was mentioned earlier, I think by Dennis. That sort of mix of freshwater sources coming from various directions was something that we could track with the chemistry that some of the Concord scientists were doing, and then back it up with what the model can tell us about, some of the fine scale motions and advective processes that link in the dynamics of that system. And the dynamics of the system are really tied into the atmospheric forcing, which is where Pat actually was part of our team. And so maybe I can sort of do that as a handoff to him and how important what he did was for us as a modeling group.
Okay, so I'm going to share just one slide real quick, because the question was, what was some of the more surprising discoveries? And actually, I want to go back to the first year. And so when the oil spill was occurring, as you recall, it didn't intrude into Mississippi Sound and Lake Bourne and the Wrigley's till a little bit later in the period. And so one of the first things we're involved in was we worked on the hypothesis that, that it was perhaps some of the cyclone activity we had in the Gulf. So we actually had a hurricane go into Mexico. You wouldn't think there'd be a correlation to that, but it turned out. So we embedded a simple trajectory program into a oceanography data set, AMSE's model, and we just simulated this with oil coming out from the source. And initially, oil stayed offshore. It actually moved in on late June 30th. This was actually associated with the cyclone that went into Mexico, which was, I thought, pretty surprising. And then a second cyclone, which was not tropical, was a non-tropical low, actually formed off here in Louisiana. Then we got a secondary surge. You can actually see this in the simulations. So that showed that the meteorological forcing would be an important role in the work. And of course, later, then I got embedded in Concord with the meteorology component.
Thank you. So I want to move on to our next question, and that is, what are some memorable ways you worked with other institutions, both inside and outside of the state, to complete your research? And so I'll kind of let you do a show of hands if you have an answer for this.
Well, I'd like to give a call out to the citizen science component. And so Jesse Kassler just did an amazing job with this. So if you go to the Concord website, if I can find it here. And this talks about the work they did with the Vietnamese fishing community. So what impressed me, so when you saw the video, it talked about the skepticism of science, and this, in particular, the fishing community is very sensitive to anything that would affect their livelihood. And what we're really trying to get across to them is that we're on their side. We're trying to understand the physics and the results of the oil spill and the implications of it. And the way that was approached is we had a series of talks where we would talk with the fishermen. What impressed me was that the readiness and eagerness for them to learn, especially when you consider English as a second language and you had to kind of go through an interpreter. But the motivation, it was very high motivation on their part to get involved. They learned how to do measurements with CTDs. They reported this data to Jesse. And so you can just see, for example, this was the CTD training off the dock here. And this was really great work, and it was a great way to embed the science with the community.
Yeah, and Jessie is going to be in our panel later on in our stakeholders panel, and she's kind of I call her a twofer because she was a PI and she was education and outreach director for Concord, so she could wear many hats and serve on many panels if she wanted. Does anyone else, Dr. Diercks, I was gonna say, I thought I'd seen your hand there.
I had, in the last 10 years while working with Gomery there, I was lucky enough to have a numerous amount of undergraduate students, graduate students, even some middle school students, high school students, assistant principal, teachers on cruises. I was able to take out there when we had empty bunks. We tried to fill those bunks with all sorts of career scientists, starting from middle school all the way to postdocs and whoever had time to come with us. That was a really fun thing, seeing out there working with us and actually being part of the team, from not being any marine science at all involved to actually going out there, running the CDD, helping with CDD, helping with sampling and all those things. That was really, really fun to do that stuff out there.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I always noticed about Gomery, was how many people were involved at various levels, many of whom were not scientists. So I'm having to kind of rush through our questions because we are getting low on time. So I want to ask you as a final question, has your Gomery work influenced the trajectory of your research or your career? And so I'm going to go back to Joe, since he hasn't said anything for a minute, and let him tell us if his Gomery work has influenced the trajectory of his research or his career.
It's not often that I get accused of not talking or of being reticent, so that's an unusual experience for me. I will say that I think that it has. Deepwater Horizon, the event happened in 2010, 2 years after I started my tenure track position here. And so being an ecotoxicologist, this was obviously and immediately going to be an event that defined that part of my career. And I had no background in hydrocarbon toxicity. I had to get up to speed on it pretty quickly. But the funding that came through that, from the initial funding from state level NRDA processes, the federal NRDA process that we were funded through, and Gomery, meant that I and a large number of postdocs and grad students and undergrads that were part of my lab throughout this were able to do a lot of research in this in a way that wouldn't necessarily have been the case. The slide we showed earlier about the relatively low amount of funding that traditionally comes to the Gulf of Mexico, that absolutely affected the work that I was expecting to do here. So having the funding source available to really do really rigorous, really in-depth, really hardcore ecotox research was a huge benefit, not only to my career, but to the numbers of people that were working with me throughout the last 10 years.
Hey, Dr. Wiggert,
well, I guess I had a couple ways to sort of address this. First, I would say for us, Concord, just in terms of what it brought together in terms of, phytoplankton specialists, observational oceanographers, and then the modeling group was a really nice blend. And in terms of an interdisciplinary project was absolutely fascinating for me. It was a great opportunity. And the thing that we kind of brought out of it with this model development, which was stood up for Concord, has given us a tool that really hadn't existed in this region previously, where we could get at looking at the physics, the very highly resolved river influences, including the Bonnie Carey spillway and other spillways that are starting to happen. And of course, we had students coming through and doing some of their thesis research on it. And the postdoc crew that we had for Concord was absolutely fabulous. And, some of those folks are coming up on the next panel. But I guess what's sort of the legacy for me going forward is this model that we stood up and we're continuing to develop agencies have picked up on what we're doing, and they're saying, hey, can you help us answer this question about if we add a new, freshwater opening, like the Mid-Breton diversion right now, we're being asked what's that going to look like in terms of how it impacts the Western Mississippi Sound and the oyster beds there, which, was brought up earlier about when you release these massive amounts of fresh water, it has a real impact on those fisheries. And that's something that the model that was sort of as a legacy of Concord is going to continue to be something we develop and grow and, bring in additional students going forward. And for my career, it's been something that's been absolutely a cornerstone that I'm building off of, which has been really appreciated.
Dr. Diercks.
For me, it's the collaboration with, in ECOGIG, we had 27 universities involved. In Redirect, I had four universities involved, and the researchers in there, I think, I forgot the numbers here and there, but it's the continued collaboration between the work we established doing ECOGIG and doing GoMRI funded research, and it's been going on and it's continuing. We are working on other proposals with the team members we had established during the ECOGIG years we had with the GoMRI funded years. So it is basically, it has helped me start up my career again and bring me back to marine snow, where I used to be in 1990 early on. I worked in the Gulf of Mexico marine snow. Nobody really was interested in marine snow in the Gulf of Mexico at that point. And it came back 2010, suddenly the marine snow, everybody's working on marine snow in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is really nice to see that. And I'm building on that, what's going on these parts there at this point.
Great. Finally, Dr. Fitzpatrick, you get to wrap us up.
Okay, so it's two things from my point of view. So I'm a meteorologist. And so that I kind of stood out in that respect because generally speaking, the rest of the field is oceanography. And it's not that I haven't worked with oceanographers, but it was always kind of on the dynamics side. So, so a couple of things. First of all, working with them, we were able to develop a very high resolution data set that was part of what Joe talked about, Jerry talked about, called the Concord Meteorological Analysis data set. And it's part of Grid C. Very high resolution atmospheric forcing data set. But for me personally, it was just the diversity of the exposure to oceanography. So now I got to work with not just the dynamics, but the modelers and the chemistry aspects and the biology. I got to expand my terminology and learn new ideas, learn more about the plankton side, technology that a meteorologist would never see, such as a flow cam, a Newston net, the imaging systems. So it was really just a whole new scope and new point of view for me to be involved in.
Well, Concord did have a lot of really fun toys, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask my early career scientist panel, who Dr. Wiggert mentioned, to go ahead and turn on their cameras, and you gentlemen to turn off yours, but be available if we have time for questions at the end. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.